At 7:43 p.m. on March 18, 1944, a limestone block weighing 47 pounds separated from the eastern wall of the Château de Montfort in occupied France. The stone fell 12 feet, struck a wooden beam supporting a crystal chandelier, and sent 300 pounds of iron and glass crashing onto a banquet table where 26 German officers were celebrating the promotion of Oberst Klaus Reinhardt to command of the 116th Panzer Division. 23 died instantly. 3 more died before midnight. The man who loosened that stone was a 51-year-old French stonemason named Henri Dubois, who had spent 8 months preparing for that moment. He would never see the result of his work. This is the story of how patience, desperation, and a lifetime of understanding how buildings stand and how they fall turned one man's trade into the most devastating single act of sabotage in occupied France. Henri Dubois was born in 1893 in the village of Beaulieu-sur-Dordogne, 40 kilometers from Montfort. His father was a stonemason. His grandfather was a stonemason. The Dubois family had worked stone since before the Revolution, building the walls that held up chateaux and churches and merchant houses across the Dordogne Valley. Henri learned the trade at 12, mixing mortar in his father's shadow, learning to read the grain of limestone, understanding which blocks bore weight and which merely filled space. By 1914, he could look at any wall and tell you where the stress concentrated, where cracks would form, which stones could be removed without collapse. That year, he went to war. He dug trenches in Champagne, reinforced bunkers at Verdun, learned that the same principles that kept buildings standing could be reversed. A well-placed explosive, a supporting beam removed. Physics didn't care about intention. He came home in 1919 with shrapnel in his left thigh and a permanent limp. He married Elise Moreau in 1920. They had 2 children, a daughter, Marie, born in 1921, a son, Thomas, born in 1923. Henri rebuilt the family business. He restored chateau walls, reinforced church foundations, repaired farmhouses. His reputation spread, careful work, honest prices. When wealthy families in Montfort needed stonework, they called Henri Dubois. In 1940, the Germans came. The occupation reached Beaulieu in June. Wehrmacht units requisitioned buildings, established checkpoints, imposed curfews. Henri kept working. What choice did he have? The Germans needed repairs on the buildings they'd commandeered. They paid in occupation currency. It kept his family fed. But Thomas joined the resistance in 1942. He was 19, passionate, reckless. He distributed newspapers, painted slogans, helped downed Allied airmen reach Spain. Henri warned him. Elise begged him. Thomas wouldn't stop. The Gestapo arrested him in February 1943. They held him at the Montfort garrison for 3 days. On the 3rd day, they took him to the courtyard and shot him. They made 10 villagers watch. Henri was one of them. They forced him to stand there, hands behind his back, while his son knelt in the dirt, and an SS officer put a pistol to the base of his skull. Henri watched Thomas fall forward. He watched the blood spread across the cobblestones. He watched them drag the body to a truck. Then they let him go home. Elise stopped speaking after that. She sat in their kitchen, staring at nothing, hands folded in her lap. Marie tried to comfort her. Henri tried to work. But every time he lifted a stone, he saw Thomas falling. Every time he mixed mortar, he smelled the gunpowder. Every time he walked past the garrison, his leg ached where the shrapnel had never fully healed. In April 1943, the Germans began renovating the Château de Montfort. The château had belonged to the Valois family since 1672. 3 stories, limestone construction, overlooking the Dordogne River from a cliff. The Germans evicted the family, turned the building into an officer's headquarters. But 2 centuries of weather had weakened the eastern wall. Water had seeped into the mortar. Freeze-thaw cycles had created cracks. The Germans needed repairs before winter. They hired Henri Dubois. He accepted the job. He needed the money. Elise needed medicine. Marie needed food. And maybe, some quiet part of him thought, maybe working inside the garrison would give him a chance to do something. He didn't know what. Just something. The repairs took 6 weeks. Henri worked alone most days, sometimes with a young laborer named Georges, who didn't ask questions. The eastern wall required extensive work. Henri removed damaged stones, replaced mortar, reinforced weak sections. German officers walked past him constantly, barely noticing. To them, he was invisible, an old French worker, a cripple with a limp. But Henri noticed everything. He noticed which officers held rank, which rooms they used for meetings, which corridors carried voices from the conference rooms. He noticed the chandelier in the main dining hall, a massive thing, iron frame, crystal pendants, hung from a beam that crossed the ceiling. 300 pounds, he estimated, maybe more, supported by oak beams that had been there since 1680. He noticed the eastern wall ran directly behind that dining hall. The wall was load-bearing. It supported the second floor. Remove too much. The floor above would sag. Cracks would spread. But remove just enough, in just the right place, and the wall would hold. For a while. Until the right stress applied at the right moment. Henri didn't make a conscious decision at first. He just started paying attention. He studied the wall structure during his lunch breaks. He examined the beam that supported the chandelier. He calculated weight distribution in his head while he worked. Physics he'd learned over 40 years. Stress, leverage, failure points. In June 1943, he overheard 2 officers discussing a banquet. A celebration, they said. Oberst Reinhardt's, promotion, important guests. 25 officers from across the region. They'd hold it in the main dining hall. Henri asked when. March, one officer said. March 18th, the Oberst's birthday. 9 months. Henri went home that night and sat in his kitchen. Elise was asleep. Marie was out. He stared at his hands, scarred knuckles, calluses from stone and mortar, dirt under the nails. He thought about Thomas, about the courtyard, about the sound a body makes when it hits the ground. He thought about the wall. The next morning, he went back to the château and began his real work. The problem was simple in concept. Weaken the wall enough that it would eventually fail, but not so much that anyone would notice before the banquet. The solution required precision that bordered on art. Henri couldn't simply remove stones. German inspectors checked his work periodically. If they saw gaps or obvious damage, they'd order repairs or hire someone else. He needed the wall to look solid while being structurally compromised. He needed failure built in, invisible, waiting. He started with the mortar. Traditional lime mortar cures through carbonation, absorbing carbon dioxide from the air, hardening over weeks. Henri had spent decades perfecting mortar mixtures, the right ratio of lime to sand, the proper water content, the curing time needed for maximum strength. Now he did the opposite. He created mortar designed to fail. He reduced the lime content by 30%. He added excess water. He mixed in fine clay that would shrink as it dried, creating microscopic cracks. The mortar looked normal when wet. It looked normal when dry. But it lacked structural integrity. It wouldn't hold under sustained stress. He applied this weak mortar in specific locations along the eastern wall, behind the dining hall. Not everywhere, that would be obvious. Just in the joints around 3 particular stones, positioned 11 feet above the floor, directly behind where the chandelier beam anchored into the wall. The 3 stones formed a triangle. Each weighed between 40 and 55 pounds. Together, they bore weight from the floor above. Not all the weight, but enough. Remove them, the wall wouldn't collapse, but it would shift. And that shift would transfer stress to the beam supporting the chandelier. Henri worked slowly. He replaced 1 stone every 3 weeks, timing it with his regular maintenance schedule. He'd remove a damaged stone. There was always legitimate damage to repair, and set a new one with his compromised mortar. To any observer, he was doing his job, fixing the wall, making it stronger. But he was doing the opposite. The weak mortar would hold for months, 6 months, maybe 7, long enough for inspections, long enough for the mortar to look cured and solid. But microscopic cracks were forming, invisible fissures spreading through the joints. The stones were settling, shifting fractions of millimeters. Physics working slowly, inevitably. By September 1943, Henri had replaced all 3 stones. Now came the harder part. The stones needed to fail at the right moment, during the banquet, when the room was full, when maximum damage could occur. Henri couldn't predict the exact moment of failure. Mortar degradation wasn't precise. The stones might hold for 8 months. They might hold for 10. He needed a trigger, something he could control. He found it in the chandelier beam. The beam was oak, 12 inches square, running east-west across the dining hall ceiling. The chandelier hung from an iron hook driven into the beam's center. The beam's eastern end anchored into the wall, the same wall where Henri had placed his compromised stones. The beam bore the chandelier's weight constantly, 300 pounds, pulling down, creating tension where the beam met the wall. Under normal conditions, the wall held firm, but Henri's weakened mortar changed the equation. The stones were settling, the beam was pulling, stress was accumulating. Henri realized he could accelerate the process. In October 1943, during routine maintenance, he loosened the beam's anchor point. Not much, just enough to allow slight movement. He removed wooden shims that had supported the beam for decades, creating a gap of perhaps 3 millimeters between beam and stone. Invisible, unless you knew where to look. But that gap allowed the beam to shift slightly each time the chandelier swayed. And each shift pulled on the weakened stones. He did this work at night. The château was quieter then, fewer officers walking the halls. He told the night guard he needed to repair water damage before it spread. The guard waved him through. Henri climbed his ladder, removed the shims, pocketed them. Then he went home. After that, he waited. Waiting was harder than the work had been. Henri continued his regular maintenance, repairing windows, fixing doors, replacing roof tiles. German officers still walked past him without looking. He was furniture to them, invisible. But inside, he watched the wall. He checked the stones weekly, running his fingers along the joints, feeling for movement. By December, he detected settling. The stones had dropped perhaps half a millimeter. The mortar was failing, imperceptibly, exactly as planned. In January 1944, a German engineer inspected the chateau's structure. Henri stood nearby, heart hammering, while the engineer examined walls and ceilings. The man spent 10 minutes in the dining hall. He looked at the chandelier, at the beam, at the walls. Then he wrote something in his notebook and moved on. Henri exhaled. By February, the stones had settled another millimeter. Cracks were forming in the mortar joints, fine hairline cracks, visible only if you knew where to look. Henri checked them constantly. Too fast, the stones would fail before the banquet. Too slow, they might hold through March and beyond. He couldn't adjust the timeline now. He'd set physics in motion. All he could do was watch, and wait, and hope the mathematics aligned. In early March, he overheard officers confirming the banquet date, March 18th, 7:30 p.m. 26 officers attending, Reinhardt's promotion celebration, wine from Paris, food from Lyon, a night of drinking and toasts, and congratulations. Henri went home that night and told Marie he loved her. She looked at him strangely. He wasn't a man given to sentiment, but she smiled and said she loved him too. Elise sat in her chair, staring at nothing. Henri kissed her forehead. She didn't respond. He lay awake that night, calculating. The stones would hold through March 18th. Probably. The banquet would last several hours. The room would be full. The chandelier would sway slightly from air movement, from vibration as officers walked below. Each sway pulled on the beam. Each pull stressed the stones. The mathematics suggested failure within that window. Suggested, not guaranteed. Henri had spent months building this moment. Now, it was out of his hands. On March 17th, he visited the chateau one final time. He told the guards he needed to inspect the roof before spring rains. They let him in. He climbed to the second floor, walked past the dining hall, stopped at the eastern wall. He pressed his palm against the stones, the 3 stones he'd set with weak mortar 9 months ago. They felt solid, but he could sense the hollowness beneath, the compromised structure, the inevitable failure waiting to happen. He went home. He ate dinner with Marie. He sat with Elise. He went to bed early. The next evening, at 7:43 p.m., the stones fell. Henri wasn't there when it happened. He was home, sitting at his kitchen table, listening to the clock tick. Marie was reading. Elise was in her chair. The night was quiet, no wind, no rain, just the stillness of early spring. At the Château de Montfort, the banquet was 3 hours old. 26 officers filled the dining hall. Oberst Klaus Reinhardt sat at the head of the table, brass buttons gleaming, knight's cross at his throat. To his right, Major Heinrich Vogel, commander of the local garrison. To his left, Hauptmann Ernst Weber, intelligence officer. Down the table, captains, lieutenants, staff officers. Men who'd fought in Poland, France, Russia. Men who'd survived years of war. They were drinking heavily. French wine, cases of it, liberated from the Valois family cellar. The bottles kept coming. Toasts to Reinhardt. Toasts to the Reich. Toasts to victory. Voices rose, laughter echoed off stone walls. The chandelier swayed slightly, crystals catching candlelight. No one noticed the beam shifting. At 7:40 p.m., Major Vogel stood to give a speech. He praised Reinhardt's leadership, his courage at Kursk, his tactical brilliance. The officers applauded. More wine poured. The chandelier swayed again, a slow pendulum motion. The beam shifted another millimeter. In the wall behind them, the 3 stones Henri had compromised were holding by threads. The weak mortar had degraded over months, microscopic cracks spreading through the joints. The stones had settled. The beam had pulled. Stress had accumulated past the failure point. At 7:43 p.m., the topmost stone separated. It didn't explode outward. It simply detached, mortar crumbling, and fell backward into the wall cavity, 47 pounds of limestone dropping 12 feet. The stone struck the chandelier beam at an angle near where the beam anchored into the wall. Oak is strong, but the impact created a crack. Not much, just enough to compromise the beam's integrity at its weakest point. The chandelier swayed harder. The crack spread. At 7:43 and 18 seconds, the beam splintered. 300 pounds of iron and crystal dropped straight down. The officers had perhaps half a second. Some looked up. Most didn't. The chandelier struck the center of the table with the sound of a cannon shot. Iron frame hitting wood, crystal exploding outward, shrapnel of glass and metal. Reinhardt died instantly, skull crushed. Vogel died instantly, impaled by iron framework. Weber tried to stand, took crystal shards through the throat, died choking. Men at the table's center died in the first second. Men at the edges died in the next 3 seconds as debris struck them. Captain Albrecht Schneider, sitting near the table's end, caught iron fragments in the chest. He lived for 40 minutes, drowning in his own blood. Lieutenant Otto Baumann, closest to the door, was struck by flying glass. He survived until midnight, then died from blood loss. By 7:44 p.m., the room was silent except for screaming. By 7:45 p.m., guards flooded the hall. By 8 p.m., 23 bodies lay under white sheets. 3 more men were dying in the château's infirmary. At 8:15 p.m., Wehrmacht investigators arrived. They examined the scene. Chandelier debris covered the table. Blood soaked the floor. They looked up at the ceiling, saw the broken beam, saw the hole in the wall where the stone had fallen. One investigator climbed a ladder. He examined the beam's anchor point. He saw the splintered wood, the crack that had spread. He saw the wall cavity behind, saw the fallen stone. He examined the mortar around the adjacent stones. He scraped a sample, tested it, found it weak, degraded, compromised. "Faulty repairs," he said. "Substandard mortar." They asked who'd done the work. The garrison commander checked records. Henri Dubois, local stonemason. He's been working here since April. "Arrest him." At 9:30 p.m., 3 Wehrmacht soldiers knocked on Henri's door. He opened it. He saw their faces. He knew immediately. "You're under arrest," the sergeant said. "You're charged with sabotage resulting in the deaths of German officers." Henri didn't resist. He kissed Marie's cheek. He touched Elisa's shoulder. She didn't respond. Then he walked out between the soldiers. They took him to the garrison. The same garrison where they'd held Thomas. The same courtyard where his son had died. They held Henri in a cell beneath the chateau for 3 days. The investigation proceeded methodically. Wehrmacht engineers examined every stone Henri had set, every joint he'd mortared, every repair he'd completed over 8 months. They found the 3 compromised stones immediately. They found the weakened mortar, the deliberately poor mixture, the calculated structural failure. They found shims in Henri's toolbox, the wooden supports he'd removed from the chandelier beam. They found his notebooks, pages of calculations about weight distribution and load-bearing capacity. They found everything. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't accident. This wasn't negligence. This was premeditated sabotage, executed with professional precision over 9 months. On March 21st, they moved Henri to a proper military prison in Limoges. On March 23rd, the SS took over the case. The Wehrmacht had prosecuted this as criminal sabotage. The SS called it terrorism. The trial took 4 hours. They held it in a converted warehouse, no jury. 3 SS judges behind a table, an interpreter, a stenographer. Henri sat in a wooden chair, hands chained, no lawyer. The SS didn't provide lawyers for terrorists. The prosecutor presented evidence: the compromised stones, the weak mortar, the removed shims, the notebooks. He presented testimony from the Wehrmacht engineer who'd examined the wall. He presented photographs of the dead officers. He asked Henri if he'd deliberately weakened the wall. Henri said yes. He asked if Henri had known the banquet was scheduled. Henri said yes. He asked if Henri had intended to kill German officers. Henri said yes. The prosecutor asked why. Henri looked at him. Then he said, "They shot my son." The prosecutor said that didn't justify murder. Henri said nothing. The judges deliberated for 20 minutes. Then they returned. Guilty of sabotage, guilty of terrorism, guilty of murder of 26 German military personnel. Sentence: death by firing squad. The execution was scheduled for March 28th. They moved Henri back to Montfort, to the garrison courtyard, the same courtyard where Thomas had died. They held him in a cell with a narrow window. At night, he could hear the river running past the cliff below. Marie visited once. They allowed her 10 minutes. She sat across from him, separated by bars, and cried. Henri told her she needed to take care of her mother. Marie said she would. She asked if he regretted what he'd done. Henri thought about that. Then he said no. She left crying. On the morning of March 28th, they took him to the courtyard at dawn. 6 soldiers, rifles, an SS officer with a pistol. They didn't make him kneel. They let him stand. He stood with his back to the wall, the same wall where Thomas had stood. The SS officer read the charges. Henri didn't listen. He was looking at the sky, at the clouds moving east, at the morning light breaking over the hills. The officer asked if he had final words. Henri said, "Tell my daughter I love her." The officer nodded to the soldiers. They raised their rifles. Henri thought about Thomas, about Elise, about the stones falling, the chandelier crashing, 26 officers dying in an instant. He thought about physics, how buildings stand and how they fall, how patience and calculation could turn limestone into a weapon. He thought about whether it was worth it. The rifles fired. Henri Dubois died at 6:17 a.m. on March 28, 1944. He was 51 years old. They buried him in an unmarked grave outside Montfort. The Germans didn't allow a headstone. The Germans kept the Banquet disaster quiet initially. 26 officers dead in a single evening was a propaganda nightmare. They released a statement claiming an unfortunate accident. Structural failure, tragic, but not suspicious. But word spread anyway. French resistance networks heard within days. A stonemason had killed 24 German officers using nothing but compromised mortar and patience. The story passed from cell to cell, region to region. Details changed in the telling. Some versions had 50 officers dead, others had the entire château collapse, but the core remained. One man, methodically planning, striking when maximum damage could occur. The story reached London by April. British intelligence officers studied the reports, analyzed the methodology. They were impressed by the precision, the patience, the understanding of structural engineering as a weapon. In May 1944, an SOE training officer incorporated Henri's method into sabotage curriculum. Learn your target's construction, he told agents. Understand what holds it up. Then remove those supports slowly, invisibly, until the right moment. By June, Free French forces in Algeria had heard the story. De Gaulle's intelligence staff discussed it in meetings. One officer suggested recruiting stonemasons and engineers for sabotage operations. The proposal went nowhere. D-Day was weeks away. Priorities shifted, but the idea lingered. The story crossed the channel with Allied forces. American OSS operatives heard it from French contacts. A lieutenant from Boston, son of a building contractor, recognized the sophisticated understanding of structural failure. He wrote a report suggesting engineers receive specialized sabotage training focused on patient, long-term weakening of enemy infrastructure. That report reached Washington in August. It sat on a desk for 3 months. In November, someone in the War Department read it and attached a note. Interesting concept. Revisit post-war. Meanwhile, the Germans responded. After Henri's execution, Wehrmacht engineers inspected every building where French workers had provided repairs. They found nothing suspicious. Henri had worked alone, shared his method with no one. But the paranoia spread. German commanders ordered increased inspections, required double-checking of all repair work, demanded engineering analysis before approving structural modifications. In the Yaï, Montfort region, they fired every French civilian worker and brought in German engineers to complete repairs. The process took 3 times as long and cost 4 times as much. Similar policies spread to other occupied regions. The paranoia extended beyond construction. If a stonemason could kill 24 officers, what could a plumber do to water supplies? What could an electrician do to power systems? German forces reduced their reliance on local labor across France, straining their resources and slowing infrastructure repairs. The irony was complete. Henri's individual act created systematic inefficiency across occupied territory. But the Germans weren't the only ones paying attention. Soviet intelligence received reports about Montfort through Free French channels. NKVD analysts studied the case, noted the effectiveness of patient structural sabotage. In 1945, they incorporated similar methodologies into partisan training programs for Eastern Europe. If Germany had won the war, Soviet resistance cells would have used Henri's techniques against occupation forces. The British took it further. In late 1944, SOE established a specialized training program focused on structural sabotage. They recruited engineers and contractors, taught them to identify load-bearing elements, showed them how to weaken supports without immediate collapse. The program trained 47 operatives before the war ended. None saw combat deployment, but the doctrine survived. Post-war, those techniques entered standard sabotage curricula at British, American, and French intelligence schools. Instructors taught students to think like Henri Dubois. Identify the target, understand its structure, introduce weakness gradually, trigger failure at the optimal moment. The methodology influenced Cold War operations. When CIA operatives sabotaged industrial facilities in Eastern Europe during the 1950s, they used patient structural degradation rather than dramatic explosions. When KGB agents targeted Western infrastructure, they studied building codes and material specifications, looking for ways to introduce long-term failures. Henri Dubois never knew his work would influence intelligence doctrine for decades. He died thinking his action was personal: revenge for Thomas, justice for his son. He didn't know he'd created a template. Quantifying Henri's impact requires looking beyond the immediate casualties. The direct toll: 26 German officers dead, including 1 Oberst, 2 majors, and 7 captains. These weren't rear echelon administrators. Reinhardt had commanded panzer units at Kursk. Vogel had organized anti-partisan operations across the Dordogne. Weber had run intelligence networks tracking resistance activities. Their deaths created immediate leadership gaps. The 116th Panzer Division, which Reinhardt was supposed to command, received a replacement commander 3 weeks late. The division's deployment to counter Allied advances in Normandy was delayed by 12 days. Whether those 12 days affected battlefield outcomes is debatable, but they existed. Anti-partisan operations in the Montfort region decreased significantly after Vogel's death. His replacement was less experienced, less aggressive. Resistance networks that had been under pressure gained breathing room. Allied intelligence reports from April 1944 noted increased resistance activity in the Dordogne. Whether causally related to Vogel's death or merely coincidental is unclear, but the correlation existed. The paranoia ripple created measurable effects. Wehrmacht records show increased inspection requirements after March 1944. Infrastructure repair times doubled across occupied France between April and July 1944. German engineering units that had been freed up for military construction were redirected to inspect civilian repair work. Conservative estimates suggest the increased inspection requirements absorbed approximately 800 man-hours of engineering time per week across occupied France. Over 4 months, that's roughly 12,800 hours, diverted from military projects to checking civilian work. Did that delay Atlantic Wall reinforcements? Did it slow runway repairs? Did it affect fuel depot construction? The Wehrmacht's own logistics reports show construction delays in spring 1944, but attributing specific delays to specific causes in a chaotic wartime environment is speculative. What's measurable is this: Henri Dubois killed 26 German officers using 47 pounds of limestone and 9 months of patience. That's a success rate of 0.55 officers per month of preparation, or 1.81 pounds of stone per casualty. Metrics that sound absurd but reflect the mathematics of structural sabotage. The methodology he demonstrated, patient, precise, exploiting structural vulnerabilities, entered intelligence training curricula and influenced sabotage doctrine for decades. Quantifying that impact is impossible, but the influence is documented. Marie Dubois survived the war. She remained in Beaulieu, cared for her mother, married a local farmer in 1947. She had 3 children. She rarely spoke about her father. When people asked, she said he'd worked in construction, died during the war. She didn't elaborate. Elise Dubois never recovered from Thomas's death. She remained in her chair, silent, staring at nothing until she died in September 1945. The doctor called it heart failure. Marie buried her next to Thomas. The Germans had finally allowed proper burial in the village cemetery. Marie tried to have Henri buried there too, but the Germans had destroyed records of where they'd buried him. She never found his grave. In 1950, she placed a marker in the cemetery anyway, just his name and dates. No mention of what he'd done. The village knew, but they didn't talk about it. The Château de Montfort remained a German headquarters until August 1944, when Allied forces liberated the region. The Germans abandoned the building. After the war, the Valois family reclaimed it. They found the dining hall still damaged, the chandelier gone, the ceiling beam replaced with temporary supports, bloodstains on the floor. They restored the room. New chandelier, new beam, new floor. But they never repaired the hole in the eastern wall, where Henri's stone had fallen. They left it open, covered it with glass, turned it into a memorial. In 1955, a French historian named Jacques Lemaire researched the Montfort disaster while writing a book about resistance activities in the Dordogne. He interviewed Marie. She showed him Henri's notebooks. She'd hidden them during the war, never surrendered them to authorities. Lemaire studied the calculations, the structural analysis, the patient planning. He called Henri's work the most sophisticated act of individual sabotage in occupied France. His book, published in 1957, devoted a chapter to the story. The book reached limited circulation. French readers in the 1950s preferred stories of armed resistance fighters, partisan battles, dramatic escapes. A stonemason who spent 9 months loosening stones didn't fit the heroic narrative. But engineers read it, architects read it, intelligence professionals read it. In 1962, an American structural engineer named Robert Hayes used Henri's methodology as a case study in a paper about building failure analysis. Hayes wasn't interested in sabotage. He was interested in understanding how small defects in construction could lead to catastrophic failures. But he cited Henri's case as an example of deliberate structural compromise. The paper influenced building code revisions in several American states, new requirements for mortar inspection, new standards for load-bearing wall construction. Henri Dubois, dead 18 years, inadvertently improved building safety standards in the United States. In 1975, the French government officially recognized Henri as a member of the resistance. They issued a posthumous citation, awarded him the Croix de Guerre. Marie was 84 by then, living in a nursing home in Limoges. They presented the medal to her in a small ceremony. She accepted it. Then she said he didn't want medals. He wanted his son back. She died 3 months later. The Château de Montfort is now a museum. The dining hall is part of the tour. Guides tell visitors about the chandelier disaster, about the stonemason who weakened the wall, about 26 officers dying in an instant. Some visitors are impressed. Some are horrified. Some ask whether it was justified. The guides don't answer that. They just show the hole in the wall, still visible behind glass, and move on to the next room. Henri's methodology, patient structural sabotage, introduced weakness, delayed failure, remains taught in intelligence training programs. Not dramatically, not with his name attached, just as a principle. Understand what holds the target together, remove those supports invisibly, trigger, collapse at the right moment. That's Henri Dubois' legacy. Not heroism, not glory. Just physics, patience, and the understanding that buildings stand because specific stones bear specific loads. And removing those stones, carefully, invisibly, over time, eventually brings everything down. He proved that one man with specialized knowledge and 9 months of patience could kill more enemy officers than most partisan cells killed in years of fighting. He proved that construction skills could become weapons. He proved that revenge, executed with professional precision, could look like an accident. He died in a garrison courtyard at 51. No memorial until decades later. No recognition until most people who knew him were dead. Just an old stonemason who loosened 3 stones and watched physics do the rest. That's how specialized sabotage actually happens in war. Not through commandos and explosives and midnight raids. Through patience, through understanding, through men who know their trade so well, they can reverse it. Who know how buildings stand so well, they know exactly how to make them fall. Henri Dubois knew. And on March 18, 1944, 47 pounds of limestone fell 12 feet and killed 26 German officers because a stonemason spent 9 months making sure it would. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.